Max and Dasha have been together for 10 years. Their marriage seemed perfect to friends and acquaintances, but something had changed in the past few months. Dasha became colder, was late for work more often, and her phone was constantly on silent mode. One evening, when she said she was going to a meeting with colleagues, Max noticed how she carefully selected her clothes, applied her makeup, and looked much better than usual for a normal work meeting. Suspicions crept into his heart. In order not to jump to conclusions, he decided to proceed cautiously. That evening, Max quietly got into his car and started following her. Dasha went to a restaurant in the city centre. He parked nearby and saw her hugging a stranger. His heart sank in pain, but instead of making a scene, Max decided to find out more. He took a few photos and then returned home as if nothing had happened. Dasha returned late at night, cheerful and a little tipsy. Max tried to ask how her evening was, but she answered curtly, "Everything was fine. Nothing special." He decided not to stop there. His suspicion has already turned into a plan. He will learn the truth at any cost. The next morning, Max woke up earlier than usual. His mind was filled with thoughts of the events of the previous evening. He decided not to act impulsively, but to make a clear plan to expose Dasha. The first step was to install a hidden camera at home. Max chose an inconspicuous place in the living room where Dasha usually talked on the phone. The camera had to capture everything he could miss. He also found a way to install a GPS tracker on her car while she was in the shower. Then Max called his friend Ihor, who worked in the IT field. He asked for help with accessing Dasha's text messages. At first, Igor hesitated whether to interfere in his personal life, but Max convinced him that it was a matter of treason, and he needed the truth. During the day, Max acted as if nothing had happened. Dasha did not seem to notice his suspicions. She said she would go to yoga with a friend in the evening. Max just nodded, trying not to show his tension. That evening, after Dasha left, Max opened his laptop and began to review the camera footage. On one of them, he saw Dasha laughing softly and saying, "I missed it too. Tomorrow everything will be as usual. He won't suspect anything." These words confirmed his worst suspicions, but Max wanted more proof, so he decided to follow her in person the next time she went to yoga. The next night promised to reveal even more secrets. The next evening, Dasha, as promised, went to yoga. Her look was too perfect for the gym. Makeup, perfectly styled hair, and expensive perfume. Max didn't say a word, just coldly said goodbye. As soon as the door closed behind her, he grabbed his car keys and followed. The GPS tracker installed the day before showed that Dasha did not stay in the gym, but in one of the prestigious hotels in the city centre. Max parked nearby and saw her get out of the car and enter the building. She did not hide her good mood, and it broke his heart. Determined to find out, Max waited a few minutes before following her. In the hotel lobby, he saw Dasha approaching a tall, confident man. They hugged as if they had not seen each other for a long time and went up in the elevator. Max stood there, not knowing what to do. Anger and despair filled him, but he decided not to make a scene. He returned to the car and, sitting in it, began to think about how to expose her beyond doubt. He opened his phone and looked at the pictures he had taken. This time there was more than enough evidence, but it wasn't enough for him. Max wanted to know the truth about everything, who this man was and how long their affair had been going on. That night, he decided to hire a private detective to find out more. He understood that he could not cope on his own, and mistakes were now unacceptable. The next day, he called the agent recommended by Igor. "I want to know everything about my wife and about this man," Max said coldly. "I want their names, addresses, and whatever else they're hiding." The detective promised to start work immediately. Max knew that this step could change his life forever, but he was ready to go all the way. Now all that remained was to wait. A few days later, the detective sent Max the first results. The report turned out to be more shocking than he could have imagined. The man with whom Dasha met was not just her lover. His name was Oleg, and he worked in a large financial company. However, the main news was that Oleg was already married, and his wife, it seems, did not suspect anything. The report also indicated that Dasha and Oleg had been meeting in hotels for several months, and their dates coincided with times when Dasha refused to spend time at home. However, the detective noticed something strange. In Oleg's financial documents, which he managed to obtain, there were traces of questionable transactions. It looked as if Oleg was engaged in money laundering or participated in some financial fraud. Max couldn't see how this applied to Dasha. Did she know about it? Could she have been involved? He asked the detective to dig further. Meanwhile, Max began to notice other disturbing details in Dasha's behavior. She suddenly became more attentive to him, as if she felt guilty. But at the same time, her phone was always with her now, even in the bathroom. One evening, when Dasha was sleeping, Max decided to take another step. He hacked her phone using a program that Igor helped install. He saw chats with Oleg in the messages. There were not only many love confessions, but also mentions of some money and documents. One of Dasha's last messages sounded like this: "We can't keep doing this. If Max finds out, everything will fall apart." These words made his heart sink. She was afraid not only because of the novel, but because of something more. Max understood that it was not just betrayal. What Dasha was hiding could be dangerous for both her and him. He did not know how to proceed. Have a conversation. Wait for new evidence from the detective. But he had a bad feeling. Max began to suspect that Dasha was involved in a game that could cost them both more than just their marriage. Max could feel the tension building. The days dragged on for a long time, and no answers came from the detective. He decided not to wait, but to act independently. Using Dasha's broken phone, Max found the address where she was supposed to meet Oleg the next evening. The location was suspicious. It was an old office building on the outskirts of town that seemed abandoned. That evening, when Dasha said she was going to yoga again, Max just nodded silently. As soon as she was out, he followed her, this time deciding that he would not just watch, but intervene. Dasha parked near the office, carefully looked around and went inside. Max waited a few minutes, then entered too. Inside, the building looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. Broken windows, dusty tables, and an eerie silence. Max heard voices from one of the offices. He approached cautiously and peered inside. Dasha, Oleg, and 2 other unknown men were there. On the table in front of them lay a large black bag filled with money and some documents. "This is the last batch," Oleg said. "Then we can disappear." "I'm not sure that's right," Dasha said, sounding confused. "If something goes wrong, they will find us." "We have no choice," one of the men replied. "You are already too deep in this." Max froze as he listened to their conversation. His suspicions were confirmed. Dasha was not only a traitor, but also involved in some criminal scam. He couldn't stand there for long as one of the men turned his head in his direction. Max managed to hide behind the door in time. His heart pounding as he quickly ran out of the building and back to the car. He knew he had to act fast because the situation was getting dangerous. Max made several calls, first to the detective to inform about the event, and then to his friend Ihor to help transfer the found data to the law enforcement agencies. Max realized that he could no longer remain silent. If he doesn't expose this scheme, it could lead to disaster. But the main question remained, could Dasha still be saved, or had she already become part of a dangerous game? After the events in the abandoned building, Max could not find peace. His mind was full of questions. Was Dasha involved in this scheme consciously, or was she forced? What kind of money is it, and what risks does it carry? Worst of all, he began to suspect that their home was no longer a safe place. The detective called back the next day to say he was able to find more information. Oleg, as it turned out, was a key link in a money laundering scheme for influential people. They used front companies to legalize huge sums. But what was more surprising was that the documents contained references to Dasha, and not just as an outsider, but as a co-participant who helped through her work. Max no longer doubted that Dasha was deeply involved in this, but he was tormented by something else. Did she know what she was dealing with, or was she deceived? He decided to ask her the question directly. That evening, when Dasha returned home, Max was already waiting for her in the living room. He held in his hands printouts with collected information, photos, transactions, correspondence. His gaze was cold and determined. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the couch. Dasha looked at him in surprise, but still sat down. Max was silent for a few seconds, trying to find the right words. "Who is Oleg?" His voice was as hard as steel. Dasha turned pale. Her eyes trembled. but she quickly gathered herself and tried to pretend that she did not understand what was being said. "What do you mean?" "He is my colleague, nothing more." Max threw the photos from their meetings on the table, as well as the documents the detective had found. Dasha was silent. Her hands were clenched nervously, and her eyes darted around the room. "You didn't just betray me," Max continued. "You are involved in something much bigger, and I want to know what it is, now." Dasha broke down. She clutched her head and began to cry. "I didn't want to," she whispered. "At first, I just helped him with little things. I didn't even understand what was happening. And then it was too late to go out. Oleg said that if I try to leave, they will destroy me." Max listened without interrupting. It was important for him to understand the whole picture. Dasha admitted that at first she was offered to help with documents because of her work, and when she found out the truth, Oleg already had her on the hook. She was afraid for her life and for Max, so she kept silent. "Why didn't you come to me?" Max asked quietly. "I was afraid that you would leave me, that you hate me." Max thought for a moment. He knew their marriage would never be the same again. But there was no time for emotions. "We'll get out of this," he said at last. "But you must do everything I say." Dasha nodded. Max knew that the next step would be crucial. He would have to find a way to get Dasha out of this game without arousing the suspicions of Oleg and his men. But that meant he would have to play his dangerous game. After Dasha's confession, Max realized that getting out of this situation would be difficult and very dangerous. He decided not to wait for Oleg and his men to take the next step. Max began to make a plan to simultaneously protect Dasha, expose the scheme, and stay alive. First, he contacted a detective and asked for help in organizing a meeting with law enforcement agencies. The detective warned that the situation was serious and mistakes could be fatal. Max agreed and asked to organize their cooperation anonymously in order to avoid unnecessary attention to himself and Dasha. The next step was to convince Dasha to help collect evidence. Max knew that without her cooperation, he would not be able to bring the scheme to life. She agreed, albeit with trepidation. "Oleg and his men should not suspect anything," said Max. "You will continue meeting with them, but now we will record everything. Conversations, documents, even their faces." Together, they bought a hidden voice recorder and a small camera that could be attached to a bag. Dasha had to wear them to all meetings. She was scared, but Max convinced her that this was the only chance to get out of this horror. A few days later, Dasha went to another meeting with Oleg. Max waited at home, nervously checking his phone, ready for any news. When she returned, her hands were shaking, but she brought a lot of material. A recording of a conversation where Oleg openly discussed new transactions, and photos of documents that confirmed illegal activities. The next day, Max handed these materials over to the detective, who handed them over to the law enforcement officers. The police began to develop an operation to detain Oleg and his team. But until this moment, Dasha had to continue playing her role. However, the situation became complicated when Oleg began to suspect that something was wrong. During one of the meetings, he asked Dasha, "Are you not hiding anything from me? You've been acting strange lately." Dasha was able to control herself and objected, but Oleg still looked wary. He ordered one of his men to watch over her. When Dasha got home, she told Max about it. He realized that they were now working on thin ice. Any mistake could expose them and put their lives in danger. Max decided to act faster. He learned that the next meeting of Oleg and his team will take place in the same office where they kept money and documents. Max passed this information on to the police, who agreed to conduct a raid. Now everything depended on one evening. Max and Dasha found themselves in a situation where any minute could be the last. Oleg's next meeting was to be decisive. The police were preparing the operation, but they needed an exact time and confirmation that all participants in the scheme would be there. Max and Dasha decided to take another chance. She was to attend this meeting and give the signal when everyone would gather in the building. On the night of the meeting, Dasha looked scared, but composed. Max tried to encourage her, although he himself felt fear. They agreed that she would press the button on her hidden device as soon as she was sure that Oleg and all his accomplices were in the room. "We're almost at the finish line," Max said, squeezing her hand before she left. "Hold on, and we'll manage." Dasha drove to the meeting, and Max stayed nearby in his car with 2 police officers who were monitoring the operation. Time dragged on endlessly. Max kept checking his phone, waiting for a signal. An hour later, Dasha finally gave the sign. She turned on the device, confirming that everyone was in the building. The police immediately moved in the direction of the office. Max watched their movements intently, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. The police surrounded the building and broke inside. Max sat in the car, listening to the conversation on the walkie-talkie. The tension was felt. Several men tried to escape, but they were quickly neutralized. Oleg was among the detainees. However, Dasha was not among the detainees. Max panicked. He jumped out of the car and ran to the building, despite the police's prohibition. Inside, he saw confused and shocked people, but he never found Dasha. Finally, one of the policemen approached him and said, "Your wife is safe. She's in another interrogation room. She was used as a witness. She cooperates with us voluntarily." Max felt his tension drop. His heart was still beating, but the main thing was that Dasha was alive. Later that night, Max and Dasha met in the room where she was sitting under police guard. Her eyes were teary, but there was no more fear in them. "We did," she whispered. "It's finally over." "Yes," Max answered, sitting down next to her. "But now a new stage begins. We have to get through this together." Although Oleg and his men were detained, Max understood that this nightmare would leave its mark. They will have to rebuild their lives and their marriage may never be the same again. But now they had hope. After the arrest of Oleg and his accomplices, the police began a full-scale investigation. Dasha became a key witness in the case, and her testimony became decisive for proving the guilt of the suspects. However, this also meant that her name was now on official documents, and she could become a target for those who remained at large. The first days after the operation were stressful. Max and Dasha moved to a temporary shelter provided by the police. They lived under guard, but the tension between them grew. Dasha couldn't seem to forgive herself for dragging Max into this horror, and while he tried to support her, he struggled with his own frustration. "We can't live like this forever," said Dasha one night, sitting by the window. "You had the right to leave me after all this." "I had the right, but I stayed," answered Max. "Now we have to find a way to move on, together." But together seemed an increasingly difficult task. The investigation dragged on, and police warned the trial could take months. At this time, Dasha could not return to a normal life, and Max began to feel how their marriage was falling apart. One day, a detective working with them warned Max that there were indications that some of Oleg's accomplices who had escaped arrest might be looking for Dasha. This forced Max to make a radical decision. He turned to the police with a request to include Dasha in the witness protection program. "It's the only way to keep her safe," said the detective. However, this decision had its price. If Dasha is included in the program, they will have to completely change their lives. A new name, a new city, breaking all ties with the past. Max began to hesitate whether he was ready for such a radical step. Dasha, hearing about this, realized that she had no other choice. She could not risk either her life or Max's life. But the main question remained, will Max go with her? "I won't force you," she said, squeezing his hand. "If you decide to stay here, I will understand. This is my punishment for what I did." Max was silent for several minutes. His mind was fighting his heart. On the one hand, he felt like he couldn't forgive her completely. But on the other hand, he still loved her. "I'll go with you," he finally said. "We will start with a clean slate, but it will not be easy." Yes, they both agreed to be included in the witness protection program. This decision finally closed the door to their past lives. But will they be able to build something new in the unknown? Max and Dasha understood that their future would now be an even more difficult test. After the decision to enter the witness protection program was made, the lives of Max and Dasha changed radically. They moved to a small town where no one knew them. They were given new names. Now Max became Artyom and Dasha became Elena. The police helped them find housing and provided initial documents, but they had to fend for themselves after that. The first weeks were stressful. Max worked in construction and Dasha got a job as a saleswoman in a local store. They lived modestly, trying to remain inconspicuous, but at the same time each of them struggled with their own fears and feelings. Dasha often sat by the window, looking thoughtfully into the void. She was racked with guilt for getting Max into this situation. She knew he had sacrificed his life for her, and it was tearing her up inside. One evening, while sitting at dinner, Max finally spoke about something they were both afraid to discuss. "We're not who we used to be," he said, looking at her. "But I want to understand whether we can still become a family. Do you want it?" Dasha lowered her eyes, trying to hold back tears. "I don't know how to fix it," she replied. "I destroyed everything. Why are you still around?" "Because, despite everything, I still love you," Max admitted. "But I want you to fight for us too. Otherwise, it's all in vain." These words became a turning point. Dasha began to work on herself. She turned to a local psychologist to deal with her feelings of guilt and fear. Max also attended support groups, where he communicated with people who were going through difficult life circumstances. Months passed, and although life remained difficult, a new closeness appeared between them. Max and Dasha decided to open a small business, a bakery, where they worked together. It helped them to distract themselves from the past and create something original, new. Although both understood that the burden of events would always be with them, they learned to live with it. They were no longer a perfect couple, but became partners fighting for their future. One day, closing the bakery after a long day, Dasha said, "You know, I think we are finally on the right track." Max smiled as he hugged her. Yes, we deserved it. Their new beginning was far from ideal, but now they knew that together they could overcome any difficulties. The life of Max and Dasha finally began to enter a stable channel. Their bakery became popular with the locals, and it seemed they were able to put the past behind them. But the peace did not last long. One evening, when Max was getting ready to close the bakery, a strange man came to the door. His appearance was ordinary, but there was cold determination in his eyes. He said hello, ordered coffee, but stayed longer than usual. "Are you new in town?" the man asked, watching Max. Max was alert but remained calm. "Yes, my wife and I moved here recently," he answered. "Nice place, quiet," the man continued, looking at Max intently. "So perfect for those who want to disappear." These words made Max's heart beat faster. The man left the money for the coffee and left, but his phrase was disturbing. Max couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't a random customer. Later that night, Max told Dasha about the stranger. She immediately turned pale. "Do you think it's them?" she whispered. "I don't know, but we can't take any chances," Max replied. "We must be ready." The next day, Max installed surveillance cameras in the bakery and also checked all the locks at home. However, the stranger did not appear again, and this only increased the anxiety. A week later, what Max and Dasha were afraid of happened. In the evening, when they were already closing the bakery, a black car drove up to them. She gave birth to 3 men, among whom was the same stranger. "We're looking for Elena," said one of them, walking towards Dasha. Max tried to get between them, but the men did not stop. One of them pushed Max to the side, and the other 2 grabbed Dasha. "We warned you," one of them hissed. "No one leaves the game without consequences." Max, gathering all his strength, rushed at them. A struggle ensued. Dasha screamed, and Max tried to detain at least one attacker. At that moment, local residents who heard the noise appeared on the street. Frightened, the men let go of Dasha and fled, leaving Max bleeding on the ground. When the police arrived, Dasha finally confessed everything. She told the local officers about her past, the witness protection program, and about Oleg. The police immediately started an investigation, and Max was hospitalized. Lying in the hospital, he looked at Dasha and said, "We thought we could escape, but the ghosts of the past always find a way back." "Now we must fight," she answered. "I won't run away anymore." This event changed everything. Max and Dasha realized that they could no longer be just victims. They would have to face those who wanted to destroy their lives again, but this time they were ready to fight back. After the attack, Max and Dasha realized that their past would no longer leave them alone. The police gave them temporary protection, but it was not enough. Max, despite his injuries, began to act decisively. He decided it was time to step out of the role of victim. "We have to find them first," he told Dasha. "We can't wait for them to attack again." Dasha was scared but agreed. She understood that passivity would only make the situation worse. They turned to their old acquaintance, a detective who had helped them before. "Are you sure you want to go this way?" asked the detective. "It's dangerous." "We have no choice. Max answered firmly. "We have to put an end to this." The detective began an investigation using contacts in the police and shadow structures. Soon he found out that the people who attacked Dasha were hired performers. They worked for Oleg's former accomplice, a man named Kostyantin, who after Oleg's arrest headed their criminal network. "He thinks you're a threat because Dasha testified against Oleg," explained the detective. "If we can find his headquarters, the police can hit him." Dasha, as it turned out, had the key to this information. In her old documents, she kept one of the access codes to the financial base of the organization. This was her chance to help expose Konstantin. Using the code, Max and Dasha, together with the detective, were able to break into Konstantin's internal network. There, they found data on his operations and places where he kept money and documents. One such place was not far from their town. Max decided to act. Together with the police, they planned a seizure operation. Dasha, despite her fear, agreed to be a part of this game, helping to decipher the data and confirm the information. On the night of the operation, Max was with the police, watching their actions. When the special forces broke into the warehouse where Konstantin was located, a shootout began. It was the moment of truth. Max knew it could all end right now, but he was willing to risk it. Konstantin was detained, and all documents and money were seized. The network was destroyed. When the operation was over, Max and Dasha sat in the car looking at each other. "We did it," Dasha whispered, her voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. "Yes, but now we really have to start a new life," Max answered. This time, they really managed to close the door of the past. Although the wounds still remained, Max and Dasha realized that together they could overcome any difficulties. But their greatest achievement was that they began to trust each other again, rebuilding a relationship that seemed to be destroyed forever. A few months after Konstantin's arrest, Max and Dasha finally felt freedom. Police confirmed that anyone who might have threatened them had been neutralized, and they could live peacefully under their new names. The bakery started working again, and life seemed to be getting better. But one event changed everything. One evening, when Dasha was at home, she found an old phone that happened to be left over from their past life. She wanted to delete all the data, but came across an encrypted message that she had missed earlier. It was sent a few days before Oleg's arrest. Dasha opened the message and it made her chill. "Max, are you sure your wife deserves to be covered for? We both know she knew more than she was letting on. If you want me to shut up, we need to talk. Oleg." These words exploded in her mind. She ran to Max, who was working in the bakery, and threw the phone on the table in front of him. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaking. Max was silent for a long time, then sighing answered, I didn't want to tell you. Oleg contacted me even before we found out about the operation. He said you weren't just a random player in his schemes. He claimed that you knew about everything from the beginning and even helped him more than you told the police." Dasha froze, her eyes filled with tears. "Do you think it's true?" she asked. Max gave her a long look. "I don't know. I thought about it for a long time, but I decided not to betray you, even if it was true, because I loved you. And maybe part of me didn't want to know the whole truth." Dasha fell on the chair. Her thoughts raced. Was she really more guilty than she remembered? Was she being used in ways she didn't even realize? She tried to remember all the details, but she could feel her mind protecting itself, creating gaps. "And what now?" she asked, looking at Max. "Now we live on," he said. "I made a decision, and I don't want to change it, even if I find out the truth one day. But you have to decide if you can live with yourself." This conversation changed their lives forever. Although they stayed together, there was always a shadow of doubt between them. And perhaps the biggest mystery was whether Dasha was really just a victim, or whether her role in Oleg's scheme was much deeper than she admitted even to herself. Life became calmer for Max and Dasha, but it was never the same again. Sometimes the past doesn't disappear completely. It remains, hidden in the form of a mystery that no one wants to solve to the end.